It is painful to die in these ways. 1 Byford Dolphin. Explosive decompression, 1983. On a cold North Sea night, the Byford Dolphin diving support rig was running a saturation dive. The divers lived inside a cluster of pressure chambers linked to a diving bell by a vertical trunk locked with a clamp. Inside, 2 men were resting in the habitat. 2 others had just finished their shift and were preparing to transfer through the bell. On deck, a tender operated the clamp. One small mistake out of the lock. The clamp released before pressures were equalized, and the entire system dropped from the pressure of tens of meters of seawater to atmospheric in an instant. The first cues were a ripping wind and steel groaning. A massive volume of compressed gas vented explosively from the chambers like a cyclone, producing explosive decompression. For the human body, that moment is unsurvivable. Gases dissolved in blood and tissues flash into bubbles, causing widespread gas emboli. The lungs and other air spaces suffer violent barotrauma. The high-velocity jet of air hammers everything in its path. The 2 divers in this habitat and the 2 men at the trunk died immediately or within seconds beyond any hope of resuscitation. The deck tender was severely injured by the blast of gas and flying metal. Clinically, the post-mortem picture is described in cool, technical terms. Instant cardiopulmonary arrest, diffuse arterial gas embolism, severe pulmonary and soft tissue barotrauma, plus mechanical trauma from the airflow itself. There was no prolonged, conscious suffering. The event happened too fast. But physiologically, it is one of the most violent collapses a body can undergo under high pressure. Investigators later identified a design fault. The clamp assembly lacked a mechanical interlock to prevent opening under pressure differential. Procedures also lacked foolproofing. No 2-person cross-check. No interlock between inner and outer doors. The result was a new suite of standards for saturation diving. Mandatory mechanical interlocks on all doors locks. A 2-operator rule. Stepwise checklists, energy isolation lockout-tagout practices, and emergency drills for a sudden loss of pressure scenario. That's why Byford Dolphin became a grim lesson. In an artificial pressure environment, a single misstep or a single under-torqued fastener can turn invisible compressed gas into a blade. So the next time you see a hatch with dual interlocks or a procedure that demands tedious cross-signatures, remember, those rules were written in the blood and air of that night in 1983. 2 Silo Engulfment. On a sweltering noon at the farm, the silo hums with the auger pulling grain toward the discharge chute. The surface looks flat and solid as a floor. A farmer steps in to stir a crusted bridge of grain. One bad footfall is enough. The crust collapses, the body drops, and the surface opens into a drawdown funnel. In 5 seconds, the grain is at his waist. 10-15 seconds later, it's to his chest. Before he can shout, he's gone, swallowed by an ocean of corn or wheat. What makes this terrifying is that grain flows like a liquid but locks like concrete. Hundreds of tons press the chest wall. Every attempt to inhale meets no air to breathe. Fine kernels and dust flood the nose, mouth, and airway, matting onto wet mucosa so that each gas becomes a spoonful of grain poured straight toward the lungs. Struggling only builds frictional grip around the legs. A rope tossed down is almost useless. Pulling hard can snap the spine, because the force to extract a person buried to the chest can exceed 400 kilos, 900 pounds, unless a relief trench is cut. Those who jump in to help are often taken by a second funnel, turning one emergency into a chain of engulfments. The post-incident condition is chilling. Victims are typically found upright, hands raised as if clawing at a wall of grain. There's little external trauma, but blue lips and extremities from lack of oxygen. Grain and dust pack the mouth and nose with a ring of fines clinging to nostril hairs and lip corners. Clothing is often askew, and boots are left behind higher up in the grain, stripped by drag. Inside, the lungs and ribcage cannot expand against the surrounding pressure. Glasses sometimes crack from impacts as the body was drawn down. In the rare cases where a head remains visible, the victim may be conscious for the first minute, speaking in short, broken phrases from chest compression, then fainting rapidly. On the death certificate, the cause is usually compressive asphyxia with airway obstruction aspiration by grain and dust. Conjunctival petechiae may be present from brief hypoxia. The physics behind this quiet death is brutally simple. When the auger runs, grain exits from the bottom, so a collapse funnel forms above. Standing in a flowing silo is like standing on quicksand, you cannot pull yourself up because material continually slides down around you. The only life-saving play is to stop the flow, cut secondary openings to create a VU slot in the wall to relieve pressure, build a cofferdam around the victim, and vacuum or scoop grain out. Any attempt to yank them up by brute force only hastens death. The dread of this accident lies in its silence. No explosion, no flames, just the dry hiss of grain each time a breath fails. It ends so fast that, to a bystander, the surface smooths over as if no one were ever there. That's why signs reading "Do not enter while unloading," overhead lifeline anchors, lockout, tag out, and the rule that someone remains topside aren't red tape. They're the thin line between a peaceful granary and a machine that eats people. 3. Boston Molasses Flood, 1919, drowning in syrup. A little after noon on January 15, 1919, Boston's North End was brittle with winter cold, when a 50-foot-tall molasses tank ruptured without warning. First came the staccato machine gun crack of rivets popping, then a black wall of syrup 25 feet high, racing down Commercial Street at over 30 miles per hour. The wave punched through timber houses, snapped the elevated rail supports, and slammed a fire station off its foundation. In minutes, the neighborhood was a brown lagoon. Molasses is a non-Newtonian fluid. It flows until cold air and turbulence make it thicken and seize. People who tried to run found their boots sucked off. Others were knocked down and glued to the street as the syrup cooled. Horses thrashed and went still. Rescuers waded in and were themselves trapped, the goo climbing to their waists like setting concrete. The way people died was brutally simple and mostly silent. Many succumbed to asphyxia. The syrup sealed the mouth and nose, and every gasp pulled viscous molasses deeper into the airway. Chest movement failed against the weight and suction. Speech broke into short, panicked phrases and then stopped. Others were killed by crush injuries as debris, timbers, wagons, entire walls rode the wave and pinned bodies beneath. In the winter air, the syrup cooled fast, adding hypothermia to the suffocation. Bodies coated head to toe in molasses, clothing bonded to skin, limbs fixed where the syrup set. Faces showed cyanosis, blue lips, and nail beds from lack of oxygen. Airways, when examined, were packed with syrup. There were few external wounds, but rescuers noted fractures and contusions from the initial impact. The dead were often found upright or half-seated, frozen by the syrup's grip. Watches had stopped, embedded in caramel brown crust. It took days of seawater hoses to thin the streets enough to work and weeks to find everyone. In total, 21 people died, and about 150 were injured. The aftermath rewrote local engineering practice. Independent structural review, stricter tank inspections, and liability that reached the company that built and filled the tank, whose leaks had been painted over rather than repaired. For years, Bostonians said the smell of molasses lingered on warm days, a reminder that a sweet, familiar liquid can become a deadly trap when physics and negligence line up. 4. Triangle Shirtwaist, 1911, locked doors and a sham fire escape. Late on a Saturday afternoon, March 25, 1911, the top floors of the Ash Building in Manhattan were full of lint and shirtwaist scraps, when a small flame in a cutting room bin on the 8th floor leapt to the ceiling. Within minutes, the 9th floor, where hundreds of mostly immigrant women worked, was a maze of tables, hanging patterns, and blocked aisles. One exit stair, the Washington Place door, was kept locked to check bags at quitting time. The other stairwell quickly filled with heat and smoke. A narrow exterior fire escape, badly anchored and never meant for a real evacuation, twisted and collapsed under the weight of fleeing workers. Down on the street, fire engines arrived fast, but ladders reached only to the 6th floor. Inside, the house hose was rotted and the valve seized. In the elevator shaft, operator Joseph Zito ran trip after trip, packing his cab beyond capacity. When the rails warped from heat, he made one last pass, and then the car could rise no more. People began to slide down the cables. Others stepped to the windows, the air behind them turning black. The ways people died were brutally specific. Many succumbed to smoke inhalation. Airways later found sooted. Bodies collapsed near windows or piled at the locked door. Faces turned toward the handle. Others suffered thermal injuries in stairwells where the heat became unsurvivable. On the sidewalks, victims who chose the only air left, the air outside, were found in normal dress, shoes on, some still holding handkerchiefs or pay envelopes. Cause of death listed as blunt impact trauma. In the elevator shaft, a few were discovered upright against the wall as if bracing for the fall. On upper floors, clusters lay near telephones and sewing machines, where seconds of hesitation became fatal. The clinical notes spoke of cyanosis, blue lips, nail beds, minimal external bleeding, and soot deep in the throat. Signatures of asphyxia rather than spectacle. In just 18 minutes, 146 people were dead. The owners, who had kept that exit locked, escaped to the roof and later beat criminal charges, though civil judgments followed. What changed was everything else. Unlocked outward swinging exits, lighted, unobstructed egress, sprinklers, real fire drills, an empowered factory inspection regime, and a louder union voice. If modern stair doors open out, if exit signs glow, if sprinklers hang over your head, it's because the quiet, suffocating terror of that day forced a city and a country to decide that a paycheck should never cost a life.